Hello, I'd like to talk to you this morning about understanding the times. It would be good for you to stop right now and to pull up the PowerPoint Understanding the Times and listen to me while we work through the PowerPoint together. I've got some really exciting news to share with you, and so let's work through this. Understanding the times. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees came, and to test him, they were asked to show him a sign from seven. He was asked to show them a sign from seven. He answered them, "When it is evening, you say, it'll be fair weather, for the sky is red. And the morning, it'll be storming today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times." Of Issachar, men who had understanding of the times, to know what Israel ought to do. It behooves us as leaders not just to hear what everyone else is saying, but to actually do the research and understand what's God doing. And that's what is God doing, and practically. And part of the whole point of our literature review and how demanding we are of you in doing your research is that you'll dig deeper than what you think you know and what everybody else thinks they know, and really get down to what is going on. That's the whole importance of the working into research. And today I've done that. I've done significant amount of research. In fact, I spent the last 3 days reading articles, researching, and finding the newest stats from 2017, 2018 about the status of the church and where we are. And so that's what we want to do in figuring out how to interpret our times. Slide 4, reviewing the U.S. church stats. You know, we've heard so much in the last however many years about the decline in the U.S. church. Probably for 20 years we've been hearing that, oh, the church is going to cease to exist, and if we don't do this or that, it's going to die. Well, I just want to let you know it's not as bad as some people think. So, is there a decline in the U.S. church? Well, there's some discrepancy about what the current attendance rates of the U.S. church are. For 10 to 15 years, we've been warned of the soon demise of the church. But wait, was that premature and overstated? In 2008, Gallup conducted the largest poll ever conducted in the United States, with over 1 million surveys taken, noting that, in fact, church attendance was not declining. In fact, you can find that book, Gallup by Frank Newport, published that as a book in 2008, and it showed that church rates in the United States were equivalent to that going back into the 50s. And while some say, well, we're losing our youth, for going back to the 50s when they started polling, they found that there was always a drop-off of youth after going to college, but re-engagement somewhere in their mid-30s as they began to marry and have children. And so they're saying, Gallup said at that point that church rates in 2008 were equal to or even better than they've been in 50 years. Stated church attendance then has been holding steady around 40 to 43% for 50 years. That's people saying they attend at least once a week or almost every week. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but you've got to realize some of the refinement in church statistics that have taken place in the last 5 or 10 years. In the 50s, they simply asked that question. When asked the same question they've asked for 50 years, they're getting about the same response proportionately as they have for 50 years. What we don't know is if they'd asked different questions 50 years ago, if they'd gotten different answers. So overall, stated church attendance, by that we mean that I say, yes, I've been going to church, has actually held consistent or even grown during the past 25 years. Although the church has not kept up with U.S. population growth. We'll look at more at that in a minute. So let's refine the data, and I'm going to take a fair amount of time looking at the data. In 2010, the Barna Group, George Barna, put out this statement. While the aggregate proportion of unreached adults is down from its high point of the past 25 years at 32%, it remains within sight of that high water mark. In other words, due to the continued expansion of the nation's population, the total numbers of unchurched people has remained relatively steady in recent years, despite the minor proportional fluctuations. So in other words, George Barna in 2010 is saying that for 25 years, unchurched adults, those who are not in church, has remained the same, even though the country has been significantly growing. Now that's important because the church has been growing, especially among people from outside. We'll talk more about that. Let's just keep moving. Slide number 8. The problem is that actual counts have shown that the number is closer to 20%. What I mean by that is that when we ask people, do you go to church, about 40 to 43% say yes. When we do what they said exit polls, where they actually do their best to count how many people are actually in church, across the U.S., the average seems to be closer to 20%. It appears that one problem is not with church affiliation, but with faithfulness and regular attendance. In other words, people are still committed to attending their church. They just don't do it as often. 40 years ago, people attended 3 times per week. Now they attend 2 to 3 times per month, and many less than that. I mean, it's not uncommon for people to attend, 6 to 10 times a year. I know I've been a pastor. I started my first church in 1982. In 82, we thought, well, people would attend about twice a week and miss about maybe once every couple months. Then I started my second church in 1991. And then we found that we had trouble we could still get people to come to a home group every week and a Sunday morning, but we couldn't get a Sunday night or midweek service to be effective. And in those, we found that people came about 3 times a month, about once a month they would miss. Well, I'm now in my third church plant, and in this church, I'm having trouble getting people to commit to a home group twice a month. And in fact, the majority of the congregation won't come to a home group at all. And it just baffles me. They just won't do it. And we find that if we can get people to come 2 to 3 times a month, we're doing well. And I've heard from others that are maybe less connected than we are that the average is about 2 times a month. And you'll have to run that by your own circumstance. But if you're struggling and feeling like people are only coming 2 to 3 times a month, that seems to be par for average. So when people say, do you go to church regularly? They'll say, yeah, I go to church. But they don't realize how often they're not going to church. So it's not that church attendance has gone down. It's that how often they go, their faithfulness to church attendance has decreased. In 2010, Barna did a survey and he noted that 83% of all adults identify themselves as Christians. That's 83%. That's 4 out of 5 people in the U.S., although only 18% are considered to be born again. Now, when you ask people, are you born again? The rates are somewhere about a third, maybe 34, 37% say that they're born again. But Barna instead made his own measurements. He asked them about, how often they attended church. Did they pray? Did they read their Bible? He just asked them basic attitudes and actions. And out of that, he said a true born again person isn't going to be doing this other stuff. And so he said about 18% are what we would consider faithful born againers, if you will. 72% stated that they had attended a church activity in the past 6 months beyond funerals and weddings, with 28% saying they hadn't been to a church activity in the last 6 months. So a large majority of the unchurched population is drawn. And he did another research, and he found that a large majority of the unchurched population is drawn from people who consider themselves to be Christians, but have been hurt in or by the church. And because of that offense, they no longer attend. He did a whole article on who are the nuns, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. But on church surveys, it's a big deal to talk about the nuns. And they go through which denomination do you go? Do you go to church? What's your church affiliation? And then they have a section called None of the Above. And so what they found is a significant growth in the nuns, none of above. We'll talk more about that. And so what they found is, as he decided to say, who are these nuns? And so he did a whole study on the nuns, who are the nuns. And he found that like 2/3 of the nuns are Christians that consider themselves to be a Christian, but they profess that they've been hurt by the church or in the church or because of someone in the church. And with that offense, they just decided not to attend. So 2/3 of the nuns are people who consider themselves to be Christian, are friendly to the church, but they just are living in their offense. Okay, moving to slide 10. What we've also found is that the decline is mostly in mainline liberal and Catholic churches. An article by Aaron Earls of Lifeway, which is the major research companies are the Gallup, Pew, Barna, Lifeway. Those are kind of the main research organizations in the U.S. Aaron Earls of Lifeway in March 2018, notes that evangelical churches are holding steady in the U.S. and that the decline has come from mainline Protestant groups. Now, I'm giving you this article. In fact, there's a number of articles I'm going to refer to that'll be in your required reading this week because they're current articles and they'll substantiate a lot of what we're saying here. So what they found in Earls gives some charts is that the evangelical church, the chart is staying steady. The people who what we would consider honest, practicing, believing Christians, that hasn't affected it at all. But those who are part of mainline churches, mostly liberal, maybe in church more for social reasons than really religious reasons, that has been significantly declining. And so the drop off in the church has not been a drop off of believing, of honest, practicing believers, but of social Christians who went there because it was the right thing to do, and they don't need to do that anymore. There's other things they can involve their lives in. An article by Schnabel and Bach, and by the way, it was a combined study between Indiana University and Harvard University, published in November of 2017, documents, in their words, the persistent and exceptional intensity of American religion, discussing the political reasons that the popular notion of church decline has been promoted. So they say actually religiosity in America has been persistent and exceptional and in its intensity. But that it's because of popular reasons. And I'd say both within the church, for speaking engagement or other promotional reasons, or outside of the church and the secular population, it's popular to trash the church and say American is dying and religion is dying in America. But the reality is current, up to date. In fact, the most current, the most up to date studies are showing just the opposite to be true. Both articles are based in solid and current research. Let me just stop for a second. Do you realize what this is saying? This is saying all those conferences, all these speakers, all that you've heard, the church is dying, is wrong. God's church is good. God's church is solid. Yeah, we need revival. We need people to get more committed to the life of the church, more committed to their spiritual disciplines. I'm not saying the church is perfect, but I am saying the church is not dying. We've been fed a line that's not true. So let's take a little deeper look, refining the data. Let's go to slide 10. Immigration. Most of the U.S. population growth is from immigration. I think in the last about 10 or so years, we've had like 50 or 60 million people immigrate into the United States. It's been huge. About 15 to 20% move into the United States. It's been huge. Most of the recent immigration has been among groups that are traditionally resistant to the gospel. They're coming in from China. They're coming in from the Middle East. They're coming in from all over the world. And many of them are traditionally resistant to the gospel. They're not open to the gospel, and hopefully in coming in the United States, they'll become more open. So even if the church grows, it still will decline as a proportion of the U.S. population until we keep up with the immigration growth. The church needs to reach ethnic groups and immigrants by planting culturally relevant churches. Slide 12. But we need to look at the number of churches. Simon Brower in 2017 published an article in the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion on how many congregations are there. And so he took the statistics from the last, 25 years or so, from 1998 to the present, so the last 20 years, and actually 98 to 2012. and he went back and reanalyzed the data. And he has if you go to the actual Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion, it's extremely detailed of his methodology, what he did. And this is the most accurate calculation of the number of churches in America. He found that in 1998 there was 336,000 churches in the United States. And in 2012, there was 384,000 churches. Well, we've been told over and over again, the number of churches is closing, the church is falling apart. Well, there you have it. That's a net gain of 48,000 churches. 48,000 churches, or a 14.3% growth between 98 and 2012, the study period. What's that, 14 years? That's an overall growth. That is, with all the net closings and plants, the net has been 3,500 more churches every year, or 1% growth per year of number of churches in the United States. Now, if the church is dying and people aren't going to church anymore, who's going to all those new churches? Much of the growth comes from the nones. You might say the nones. I thought, wait a second. I thought you said that the nones were not there. Well, we'll get there. That's not the no's. That's not the nuns, none of above, but the nones. In other words, as they did analysis, they found that those who consider themselves non-denominational churches grew from 54,000 in 1998 to 84,000 in 2012. In other words, the unaffiliated churches have been growing substantially and continue to grow. Gibbs noted in 2005 that approximately 4,000 churches were being planted in the U.S. every year, which at that time was an all-time high. I don't have newer statistics than that, but when you look at the total number of churches, I'd have to say that's been sustained. All the focus on church planting is working. We're starting lots and lots of churches, and the number of churches is growing. Is it possible that God has already begun to work in our time, but we're not aware of it? We're so busy listening to those who are saying the church is dying that we don't even see that God's working and the church is increasing. And even if the raw numbers are down of how often people attend, what we've got to see is that the more churches they have, that's the more hands that are intentionally reaching out unto the lost. Let's take a little deeper dive into this. Slide number 14. So why the discrepancy between the increase in churches and the supposed fast decline of the church? Well, first it has to do with survey methodology. There's been significant questions raised about survey methodology. For example, when asked what denomination belongs to, when they do the survey, they say, okay, which church are you affiliated with, or which denomination do you belong to? And then they give them, is it a mainline denomination? Is it? And they list off. And as they go down the list, if people answer, well, none of the above, when affiliated with a non-denominational church, they're lumped into the nones, none of the above, a group often considered to be those becoming totally irreligious. The reality is a significant number of the nones are going down the list and saying, I don't belong to a denominational church. I don't belong to anything like that, because in their mind they're saying, I go to an unaffiliated church. My church is non-denominational, so none of the above. A second thing has to do with house churches. Another significantly unreported group is the house church movement. In fact, it could be argued that of this 380,000 churches that are in the U.S., that a significant number of house churches aren't even counted because people don't necessarily consider that as a church. And yet we've heard that the numbers are millions of people throughout the United States that are involved in the house church movement. And it's possible that that may account for significant additional numbers of people otherwise deemed to be part of the nones, which could potentially increase the total number of congregations substantially. In other words, the figures are not yet refined well enough. In fact, in all the studies I've looked at and examined and read, no one includes in the house church movement, not a one that I've been able to find. Let's talk about church stability. Mark Chavis and Aswana Anderson in 2008 and Continuity and Change in American Congregations. Took a deep dive in the sociology of religion, and they made some interesting conclusions. In that major study in the Continuity of Change in the United States, they documented the stability of the Christian church. Here's a quote from them, and we expected to observe much continuity. This expectation was indeed borne out, with no change since 1998 in average size, internal conflict, the overrepresentation of women, an extent of political activity, the percent of congregants led by women, involvement in social services, and other characteristics. So from 98 to 2000, they did a 10-year dive on the church. And by the way, in 2008, that was right when everyone would say the church was dying. And they looked at it and they found the average size, how everything about churches looked essentially the same as they had 10 years previously. For we have several studies in the class on women in leadership ministry. Interesting observation here that congregations led by women showed no statistical change either in this. But one of the conclusions, and I didn't include it here, is that they said the number of churches the number of churches closing is very little. That churches, one of the things they found is churches are incredibly resilient, and you pound them, you pound them, you pound them, and you pound them, and they just bounce back up. That they're extremely hard to kill a church. Now, unfortunately, sometimes man does it. I mean, we come in denominationally are closing churches that in reality, a lot of those churches that we're closing, they might not have to close. If we would just allow resilience to find its place, we might find they would bounce back. So the statistics are saying churches aren't, they're solid, they're strong. They just keep going. Schnabel and Bach in 2017 pressed back against the common assumption of the secularization of the United States. And we've heard how that we're in a post-Christian world and that the U.S. is becoming more secularized. Well, this study, which I mentioned earlier, out of Indiana and Harvard, said recent research argues that the U.S. is secularizing, that this religious change is consistent with the secularization thesis, and that American religion is not exceptional. But we show, and I took this right out of their abstract, but we show that rather than religion fading into irrelevance, intense religion, strong affiliation, very frequent practice, literalism, and evangelication, I'm not saying that well, am I, is persistent. And in fact, only moderate religion is on the decline. In other words, a major study from just 8 months ago is coming to the conclusion that actually the church is becoming secular and the church is dying is wrong. And they argue in great detail to show that it feeds a secular mindset. If the news media and the liberal elite can convince the world that we're secular and we buy into it, we begin to feed into that mindset and we concede ground that we don't have to. But as in fact, religion is not giving way to secularization. What we're finding is that those who are giving way to secularization are primarily those who come from only a moderate religious experience, but that those who are truly evangelical, the evangelical church and the believing church is as strong or stronger than ever in the core power of its faith. Now, yet consistency is down, but that's a whole nother issue. Let's take a look at church size. There seems to be some discrepancy about what is the current attendance rates of the U.S. church. We're told that the church averages, and I've seen figures anywhere from 140 to 185, and the figures that I have shows about 160. I just want to tell you, throw those figures out. They're irrelevant. Let's assume that you and your friend down the street, and let's assume your church runs 100 and their church runs 1,000. Someone will come along and say, well, the average churches of cities, the average attendance of churches in this town is 500. Well, you look around at your 100 people and you feel worthless because you think, gosh, everybody's running 500, I'm only running 100. So averages are worthless. If you have a church that's running 20,000 and you have a lot of smaller churches, it skews the average attendance up, but that's not really accurate. A much more helpful figure is what we call median. That is, if you take a list of all churches and you ask, where's the middle point? So that there's just as many churches above this point and below this point. Above this point and below this point. What's the middle spot? The middle spot in the United States is 55. The middle spot in the world is 55. The middle spot in Foursquare is 55. It just seems to be that the true median size, if you will, the true average church in America is around 55 people. So that means if your church on a regular basis is averaging 75 people, you're in the upper half of all churches in the United States. And if you're running 45, 50 people, you're right as the average church in the United States. In fact, many years ago, Lyle Schaller wrote an article in Leadership Magazine called The Fellowship of 40. And he noted that most churches, most choirs, most youth groups, most every group tops out at about 40, because that's about how many people you can know on a personal basis. And beyond that, it's kind of at a distance. And so unless the church is organized so that you have multiple subgroups of 40, that it's probably going to tap out at around 40. And if you think, where's the 55 come in? 40 adults plus their kids and infrequent attenders. And that's what it is. So half of all churches run more or less than 55. In fact, 90% of all churches in the United States average less than 350. Now, listen to that. If your church runs 400, you're in the top 10% of all churches in the nation. 90% of all churches run less than 250, and 80% run less than about 150. And only 3 to 5% run more than 2,000. Actually, I think it's 3 to 5% run more than 1,000, and less than 1% runs more than 2,000. But about 20% of all Christians attend churches over 1,000. So it feels like everybody's going to these mega churches. The reality is 1 out of 5 does go. That's a significant amount. But if we disdain the smaller churches and we think, well, why don't we just close all these little churches? I hear this all the time. We could just get rid of all these churches because the big churches, that's where it's at. We would lose 80% of believers, because 80% of believers are in churches under 1,000, only 20% in churches of over 1,000. We need other smaller churches. Furthermore, an interesting fact that we're finding is that for the most part, secular people, the postmodern people, prefer small churches. They don't want to be a name and a statistic. They want to be a person. And in the small churches, they can be known and cared for. In the large churches, they're a number in a crowd. And so what we're finding is that Christians love the larger churches, but that non-Christians, they really just want to be cared for. Moving to slide 18. Let's make some observations to tie it together. It appears that the church is not yet dead or dying, even given the large influx of immigrants and increasing secularization of society. Where secularization is happening, for the most part, is taking place among those who were previously only moderate in their faith. Lost people are less likely to consider themselves Christian, so that it is becoming clearer to distinguish believers from non-believers. Re-engaging people back into Christian fellowship is as important as evangelizing the lost. Slide 19. So what do these current statistics say about the idea that we are now living in a post-Christian world? Well, at the very least, there are significant current studies pushing back at the idea that Christianity is dying. And we've already substantiated that. It seems that people are not turning away from their faith so much as their self-focus is allowing them to turn away from fellowship due to the myriad of distractions or because of their perceived personal hurts and offenses. I'm not so sure that we're living in a post-Christian world. I think we're in a changing world where not everyone believes that they're Christians, but still 70 to 80% consider themselves Christian. So let's take a look at the marginalization of the church and social dislocation. The church is under assault due to sociological and cultural shifts, which is what this class is all about, especially as the media has often cast the church and its leaders as being hateful, greedy, corrupt, and irrelevant. Pastors and Christian leaders tend to be isolated from the secular culture and all too often are unaware of the cultural shifts that are radically changing the social location of the population. The common approach is to encourage congregants to disengage from secular activity, which on its own is not bad. Unfortunately, the approach does not seem to be working, but instead tends to further alienate the church from society and in the process erodes what little influence the church has in the community. The church is under assault due to a number of reasons. Church failures. Instead of disengaging, very visible and public church leaders have succumbed to the very sins that they themselves are condemning, giving rise to mistrust and the criticism of being hypocritical, and the process legitimizing the criticisms levied against them. I mean, in my lifetime, when I have my doctorate of ministry in church growth, which I received in the mid 1990s. I did my classes in the mid 80s, and I actually finished my dissertation actually in the late 80s. So I did my dissertation and my research all in the 80s. And at that time, there was a number of heroes. They were the largest churches in America. They were the people we studied and read. Well, more than half of those top churches have now been have been if you will, cast down because of either immorality or for financial questionable issues. In other words, half of our heroes in the last 20, 40 years have come down. And in fact, one of the largest churches in America is embroiled right now because the pastor is under assault. One of the greatest leaders in the United States, because now it's coming out that supposedly he's had an affair, an ongoing affair for the last dozen years or so, and multiple women are coming out and everybody's up in broil. And just last year, one of the largest churches in America, by far the largest emerging church in America, the pastor had to step down, and it's just never ending. Which brings up my second point, the inability to police its own. From priests molesting children to leaders of the largest churches and ministries repeatedly being exposed with immorality or corruption, the storyline just repeats itself over and over. And until we get a handle on this, yeah, it's not looking so good. And engagement in policy, politics. I've got a real concern. I mean, from 98 to 2008, it was shown that there was very little engagement in politics, save possibly the one exception was in helping to register people to vote. But in this last several years, there's been an engagement of the church in politics aggressively and unfortunately supporting a vilified leader. And, you say what you want, and I'm not into the politics at this moment. The issue is that those on one side of the political island absolutely with a vitriol hatred of the current president, and they despise him, and the church is championing him, and yeah, he might be making some good decisions around about the courts and turning it more conservative, more towards religious rights. But on the other hand, to just justify that for some of the other elements of his character, the church, and there's a lot of people who are just backing away from the church, or worse yet, the political enemies on the other side, then knowing to get what they want, they're going to have to rip the church. And getting involved in politics is never a good thing for the church. The church, that's not our place. And I'm questioning whether or not it could potentially turn marginal and young believers away. I've read that many young unaffiliated churches are pulling out of calling themselves evangelical. They won't even call themselves evangelical anymore because they don't want to be identified with the political arm of the evangelical movement. So you'll just have to contemplate that. Are these issues passing in importance? Has the response by the church to the continuing worldwide disasters, this is kind of the other side of it, has the church by the continuing worldwide disasters their emphasis on social justice, their intentional racial and generational reconciliation, has this created in society a more positive view of the church. So on the politics is a negative, and the corruption and the immorality on the one hand, but on the other hand, the church is doing so much good that people are looking positively for the church. The church is the first one in, and the church is helping. So people love the church that touches them. And so we have to ask the question, is the Holy Church breathing his gentle voice again? Is revival on the way? And I certainly hope so. I'd like to see revival break out. But to be honest, revival does not need to break out in the world. Revival needs to first break out in the church, in our fervency, in our consistency, and people crying out to God instead of trying to get home as quickly as possible so they can re-engage all of their stuff. Okay, moving on to slide 24. Another issue is no distinguishable differences in lifestyle between professing believers and those not following Jesus. Moving on, we find rapidly changing attitudes toward what is right, wrong, and exclusively true. Not only has the world become more postmodern in its thinking, but the church has followed suit. There are two types of postmodernism. That which is taught in schools of higher learning. And, 10 years ago, everybody was talking about postmodern this, postmodern that. And I think it's kind of like as fads go, kind of passing on. And you don't hear quite as much about postmodernism as much. And they're kind of moving on to the next topics. And so there's kind of this ecclesiastical, or not so much that, but the scholastic postmodernism. But there's a deeper postmodernism that relates to the attitudes creeping into the thinking of the common person, including Christians. It's kind of like just how they approach life. Their culture is sliding. The latter is far more pervasive and destructive, and often because it's a part of culture is undiscernible. Survey after survey have demonstrated that there is at best a 5% difference between the behaviors of Christians and the behaviors of non-Christians in issues relating to morality, such as divorce, immorality, abortion, drinking, abuse of drugs, living with your partner, even homosexuality. The church is not living different. It's just slightly different. Thus, the ever-persuasive secular culture, led by the immoral behavior of our leaders, cultural, political, business, even Christian, exampled everywhere in the ever-present media and lived out daily in people, wherever we live, work, and play, is eroding the morals and behaviors of believers. If we don't stem the trend, the church will fade into irrelevance as a cultural force. Have we lost our way as salt and light? And is that one of the reasons why it feels like the world is becoming more secular? Finally, the undiscernible embrace of fads and methods. There's a fine line between adjusting ministry to stay current and culturally relevant and changing the purpose and place of the church after every conference. People are looking for truth. Every time we uproot all that went before us or change our name, we communicate that we don't have it figured out yet. In the end, they will simply look elsewhere for answers. For example, I've known McDonald's my whole life, and I've known Walmart my whole life. And you know what? McDonald's doesn't change its name every 6 months. McDonald's doesn't change its name and then say, we're planting a new burger place. We've got a new name, and we've got 20,000 locations around the world. They don't do that. They're McDonald's. But in the church, someone pioneers a church, they grow it up. Someone new comes in, they go, this church isn't like me. So what do? They change the name. They tell everyone, look, I've pioneered a new church. Hogwash. What the community says is this church that was engaging, evangelizing, suddenly when they say, hey, we've changed our name, we're doing something else, the people in the world just think, wow, the churches don't make it around here very long, do they? They come and they go. They come and they go. Why do I want to invest in something that's not going to be here in 2 years? Our lack of consistency, and we think we're doing something fresh. We got a new name. But the community, if we're reaching the community just thinks we don't know what we're doing. So why should they invest in us? Continuity is what they're looking for. consistency. Think about that next time you rush ahead to change a name or change an image in the life of the church, in the life of the community. So a proposal for a positive future. Thus, it seems that the situation in the U.S. is not as bad as some have contended. There are, however, several keys that are necessary to the future health and growth of the church. A proper engagement with secular culture. Solid discipleship that focuses on behavior rather than knowledge. A focus on planting churches that can reach marginalized and or emerging cultures and immigrants. And a focus on establishing congregations among the growing ethnic populations. Well, there you have it. Gives you lots to chew about. I've probably stretched some of you. Read the articles, dig in, and, happy researching. God bless.